Welcome to our second video on market structures. In our previous video we looked at perfect competition, and in this one we're going to go on to look at monopolistic competition, oligopoly and monopoly. And as you can see from this diagram, we're moving towards markets where there is less and less competition. So we're going to start with monopolistic, which in many ways is similar to perfect competition. However, there are some differences. There are still a large number of firms. There are still no barriers to entry. It's easy for new firms to enter monopolistic markets and to leave. However, the difference really between perfect competition and monopolistic competition is that in a monopolistic market there is product variation, product differentiation. So the products are slightly different from each other, and therefore businesses have some control over price. But in order that they let the consumers know about the differences between their products, there tends to be heavy spending on advertising and other kinds of selling costs in a monopolistic market. So typical industries where there is monopolistic competition. Things like taxi and minibus companies. Taxis are all very similar, aren't they? But they are different. Some of them we can order via an app, others we can't. Some of them are much more luxurious, others are much more basic. It's the same with sandwich bars and coffee stores, isn't it? They all sell basically the same things, coffee, other drinks, sandwiches, but their products are slightly different from one another. Hairdressers are the same. All of these are good examples of markets where there is monopolistic competition, lots and lots of businesses competing, but slight differences in the products and therefore slight differences in the pricing. So we move from there straight on to oligopoly, and in an oligopolistic market there are a small number of large competitors. And in an oligopoly, the firms, because there are a small number of them, tend to be dependent on each other. They're interdependent. Quite often, most of the time in this market, there is what we call a 5-firm concentration ratio of more than 50%. In other words, in an oligopoly market, it's very common for just 5 businesses to have 50% of the entire market share between them. So they're dominant businesses. There may be more than 5 businesses, but these big 5 are dominating the market. And that's because in an oligopoly market, typically, there are some barriers to entry. Products tend to be different from one another. And the problem with oligopoly markets, because there's such a small number of dominant firms, there is a danger of collusion. And we will look at that in more detail shortly. So, collusion, what is it? Collusion is when businesses work together to try and stop prices going too low. In other words, the businesses come together to protect their interests, and sometimes they do things which are not necessarily in the interests of the consumer, and therefore it's not necessarily the most efficient market structure because it doesn't provide the best outcomes for everyone. But it does happen, and it's likely to happen when there are just a few firms, when those firms are open and talking to each other, when those firms have similar production methods and similar costs, and they have similar products. But it also happens when there is a dominant firm or dominant firms. There has to really be significant entry barriers for collusion to take place. Otherwise, if dominant firms try to fix a high price, then new businesses would come in and have lower prices, and collusion wouldn't really work. So the fact that in oligopoly markets there are often significant entry barriers means that collusion can happen. It also is more likely to happen when there is a stable market and when the government is not taking measures to try and stop it from happening. So we're going to look in a bit more detail now at what collusion can really do in the market and why it's a bad thing.
Price fixing. When two or more businesses collude to decide what prices they're going to charge, this is known as price fixing. It puts less pressure on them to keep their prices down, which cheats their customers who end up paying over the odds. Businesses that agree to fix their prices deprive customers from getting a fair deal, and their victims will often be other businesses as well as consumers.
So we can see, can't we, that in an oligopoly market, price fixing can and does sometimes happen, but it's really not in the best interest of an efficient market, and it's certainly not in the best interest of us as consumers. So, some examples of oligopoly. Think about supermarkets. In the UK, we have really 5 big supermarket brands. Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Asda, and so on. 5 big supermarket brands, and they dominate the market. Between them, they have a huge market share, and they have been accused of collusion occasionally in the past. Think also about perhaps games consoles, computer games, video games. Sony, Nintendo, they have a huge market share in that gaming market, and they dominate the market, don't they? Just 2 or 3 firms. So there are some advantages in an oligopoly market, and I mean advantages for everyone, even the consumer. One is that because these businesses are so big, they can really benefit from economies of scale. In other words, they can produce more cheaply because they're so big. They can buy in bulk, they can find cheaper ways to operate in a way that smaller firms can't. These businesses also produce more than normal profit. Do you remember we said that in perfect competition, every business made just enough profit to survive, normal profit. In an oligopoly market, more profits are generated, and that can be used for investment. If we go back to our example of computer games, think about how those businesses have to invest huge amount in the development of new games. Think about pharmaceuticals, another oligopoly market, big firms dominating the market. Other firms can't get in easily because they have to invest so much money and so much research and development in developing new medicines. But for these dominant firms, they're making a profit so they can invest in medicines for the future. In an oligopoly, the businesses tend to be very responsive to changes in consumer demand. However, there are some disadvantages. As we've already seen, there's this risk of collusion, and in particular price fixing. And there's generally less incentive to compete. Firms will always try to maximise their surplus, which of course minimises our consumer surplus. And they do that because they can. Because they can. There's not lots of other businesses coming and snapping at their heels trying to take over their market share. So there's less incentive for them to compete. When we talk about all these different market structures in economics, we talk about them as though they're very separate from one another. But the truth is, in the real world, the boundaries are much less clear. And it's quite hard sometimes to tell the difference between, for example, an oligopoly market or a monopoly. Look at some of these examples. The London Underground is very close to being a pure monopoly, but there is some competition. The buses, for example, taxis, they're not very close substitutes, but they are substitutes. We talked about the supermarkets earlier, the big 5 supermarkets, of which Tesco's is one. This is definitely an oligopoly market. However, if you live in a town where there is only one supermarket and that supermarket is a Tesco, then that is, in reality, that's a working monopoly for you. Pepsi and Cola. Not really an oligopoly, you might think, because you can buy lots of other Coke, you can buy supermarket own brand Coke, but in terms of those brands, we talk about that as they're dominant. There are other Coke brands you can buy, but these two are very dominant, and we call that a duopoly. 2 businesses, duo, a duopoly. So the lines are not very clear-cut, but it's useful for us to look at all these different structures because it helps us understand the ways that different businesses operate in different markets. So the last market structure we're looking at is monopoly. And in a monopoly market, there is generally only one competitor. And that's because the barriers to entry are so high. Look at this picture here. If you wanted to start up a new train company, you would have to build new stations all along your route. You would have to build new railway lines all along your route. This is so expensive and so difficult to do that it creates a huge barrier to entry that really no other business can get over. And so we tend to have just one firm in this kind of market. But it is quite rare. So what exactly do we mean by monopoly? Well, as I said, there are high barriers to entry usually. Very high barriers to entry, always in fact. The products are very differentiated. So I've talked about monopoly being one competitor. Mono is one. And that's generally true, but again, it's about dominance. So there might be other competitors, but the one competitor is a dominant one. So in this kind of market, there are huge barriers to entry, but there can be some product differentiation, and there is very often brand loyalty to the market leader. The established firm as well will have lower costs. Think about a company like Microsoft. It's already done lots of its research and its development of its software and so on. It's just got to build on that now. That's much lower cost than a business that's just starting out in that market. In a monopoly, the dominant business has ownership and control of key factors, like the railway stations and the railway lines. It has ownership and control over key outlets, as some of the supermarkets do and the banks. It will have legal protection often for its ideas, as pharmaceutical companies do and as games companies do. And in these markets, there's often mergers and takeovers. The big businesses very often operate in a way that instead of competing with new businesses in the market, they will take them over. They display quite aggressive tactics in doing so as well sometimes. So there are a few examples of monopoly, but they are few. Think about Windows. If you have a PC, it isn't actually the only operating system you can use, but it is the operating system that's used by the vast majority of people who have a PC. Think about your water supplier. Are you really going to have two sets of pipes coming into your house so that you can have some choice between who supplies your water? Energy is a similar thing. The fixed costs there, the infrastructure that you need to deliver water, to deliver power, is so big that it creates an enormous barrier to entry for new businesses. So we talk sometimes about natural monopolies, markets where it just seems to make sense to have one provider, like water, like railways. But now we've got all these digital businesses coming, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're getting bigger all the time. Some of them evolved from being a business to a whole market almost. Think about Google. In the West, we don't talk about searching, we talk about Googling. Are they natural monopolies? Well, I think time will tell. Because these platform businesses, they bring consumers and suppliers directly together. There is no chain in between, there's no retailer. It's very easy for powerful big companies to dominate the market. Let's have a look at this little video which explores the dominance of some of the businesses in the IT world.
These are the 5 most valuable companies in America. Notice anything? They're all tech companies, and their dominance is attracting attention from watchdog groups that say their market power is harming competition and the economy. Is it time to break up big tech? To answer that, you have to understand how tech has exploded. For our purposes, let's imagine the top 5 tech giants as Pac-Man or Pac companies. Except in this game, there are no ghosts around to avoid. No Blinky, no Clyde. Those ghosts are US regulators. For the past decade, the US has been mostly hands-off with big tech companies, letting them become even bigger by swallowing smaller rivals or entering new markets. Bloomberg data show that in the last 10 years, the Big Five have made close to 500 acquisitions worth about $140 billion. Because consumers like the company's products, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google have developed huge market shares. For example, Amazon receives about 93% of all ebook sales. Google pulls in about 78% of internet search ad spending in the US. Similarly, Apple and Facebook dominate in high-end smartphones and social media traffic. But being a monopoly isn't illegal in the US, or most other countries. Regulators stopped equating big with bad a long time ago. Monopoly cases brought by the US have also dwindled. In fact, the last high-profile case was filed in 1998, when the Justice Department successfully challenged Microsoft's dominance of computer operating systems. And that 20-year dry spell in monopoly cases has led some watchdogs to say that enforcement in the U.S. has become too timid. They say big tech is hurting innovation, jobs, and wages, and some even blame the behemoths for a decline in successful startups. In Europe, America's big tech companies have faced more resistance, with governments more aggressively pursuing them. For example, the EU has fined Google for abusing its market dominance, and Germany is investigating Facebook for its privacy practices. Of course, the big tech players don't think they need to be broken up. They argue their dominance isn't guaranteed because new competitors can easily jump in. As Google likes to point out, competition is just one click away.
Competition is just one click away. I'm not sure whether that's true. I don't know what you think. However, monopoly. There are some advantages. The same kind of economies of scale are possible that we get in oligopoly, in fact even bigger, even more so. And that economy of scale will result in lower prices which can be passed on to the consumer. There are big profits in a monopoly. If you've got little or no competition, you can charge high prices and make big profits. But on the plus side, those profits can be used for investment to develop the market and develop products for the future. The high profits encourage some risk-taking, and that can be a good thing because it gives us innovative new products that we all love. However, there are some definite disadvantages of monopoly, and that's why governments get involved. Because there's no competition, they can charge high prices. They are price makers. They can more or less charge us what we want, especially if demand for their products is inelastic. And there can be a lack of incentive to innovate. And certainly in the UK, I think many would accuse our railway companies of just that, a lack of innovation. So advantages and disadvantages. Okay, let's just finish with a summary of what we've learnt today. So we looked at the 4 different types of market: perfect competition, monopolistic, oligopoly. And we saw that the number of firms goes from very many in perfect competition all the way down to just 1 in monopoly. We understand now that in perfectly competitive markets and monopolistic markets, it's very easy for new businesses to enter the market. There are a few barriers to entry or exit. However, in oligopoly, this becomes more difficult. It may be that you need a large amount of capital to enter this market. It may be that you need land, or it may be that you need technology and patents, but there are lots of barriers. Entry is restricted. In a monopoly, it's almost impossible for new businesses to enter those markets. How about the nature of the product? Well, in a perfectly competitive market, we said that all products are homogeneous, identical, undifferentiated. Whereas in monopolistic competition, products begin to be differentiated. Interestingly, in oligopoly, they can be either. And it's quite difficult, again, to draw a line, really. If we think about banks, there are many different banks, retail banks. They pretty much all offer us pretty much the same service, don't they? Supermarkets are similar. But in a monopoly, the product tends to be unique. It's not offered by anyone else at all. So we've got some examples. Perfectly competitive markets tend to be agricultural products. Monopolistic, where the products start to be a little bit different from one another, things like builders or restaurants. Oligopoly, cars, Good example of oligopoly, a few dominant firms. We talked about banks and supermarkets, electrical appliances maybe. And monopoly is usually things like water companies, train operators, particularly if you're only looking at particular routes. Now, we haven't discussed this so far, but I want to say something about the demand curve in each of these different markets. So in a perfectly competitive market, the demand curve is horizontal. The firm is a price taker. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means if the firm puts its price up at all, even by the tiniest amount, it will lose all of its customers. So it gets a horizontal demand curve. In monopolistic competition, we see more of the downward sloping curve, but relatively elastic because there's lots of competition and therefore lots of substitutes, so consumers can go elsewhere if prices rise. In an oligopoly, again downward sloping, but this time it's relatively inelastic because there's not so much competition, therefore fewer substitutes. However, the shape does depend on how competitors act in the market. In a monopoly, again a downward sloping demand curve, but more inelastic. The firm has considerable control over price because there are no substitutes, really, no close substitutes anyway. So this is a summary of what we've learned in this video. There are a few questions now for you to answer.